Добрий день, друзі, партнери, колеги. Можемо починати
Good
трансляцію.
afternoon, friends, partners, colleagues. We can start our broadcasting. We would like to welcome you at the next event of the educational platform PITCHUA. Educational platform PITCHUA, as well as the grand competition for the socially important content PITCHUA Plus. It's the project of the TCA, Transformation Communications Activities, and this is the educational activities of the PHA platform, and the grand contest is being carried out in cooperation with the Ministry of Culture and Educational Policies of Ukraine. I am Alexander Klimbenov. I am leading the direction of television and content in TCA. And at this workshop, I'm going to be assisted by my colleagues, Olga Mikhailichenko and Tatiana Kuznichuk. Today, we are going to have an extremely interesting workshop for all those who are making or making documentaries. Today, we are going to discuss why a documentary project is not an extended coverage in time for the television news, and how different the documentary project is from the usual report on the news. And today, this workshop is going to be conducted by our consultant, the consultants of the grand competition PHA Plus, who a couple of months ago had an opportunity to carry out doctoring sessions with the applicants of the grand competition. And these are our British consultants, Izzy Charman and Paul Copeland. Izzy Charman is a producer, a scriptwriter, a writer, and researcher. And she's also a winner of the DFAT prize. And she has a 20 years experience of being a producer, and she was working with the BBC, Netflix, Discovery, National Geographic, and she is a nominant of the BAFTA award. And I would like to give the floor to Izzy and Copeland, and there is a function of the simultaneous interpretation. Switch on, listen at this workshop. You will have such an opportunity to listen it in the original language. We also are broadcasting this workshop in YouTube, and you have a chance to listen both of them in the English and the Ukrainian version. And now I would like to give the floor now to Izzy and Paul.
Could I jump in there?
Paul, you're muted.
Can you hear me, Alex?
I can hear you.
Yeah, very good. Thanks so much, Alex, for introducing us. Yes, as Alex said, my name is Paul. I've had the pleasure of working with PITCHUA for 2-3 years now, and more widely in Ukraine with Ukrainian partners, and I remain full of admiration for the efforts and diligence that you guys are going through to tell your country's story. So very pleased to be here today. As Alex briefly alluded to, Izzy and I both have a background in documentaries, international documentaries. I've worked for 20 years for all the major broadcasters in the world, so BBC, Netflix, National Geographic, etc., in documentaries on international subjects. I also do work in television drama, but I think fair to say that documentaries remains my first love. I have a BAFTA nomination actually on a project I made with Izzy, and various other awards and nominations. So I am very pleased to be here today, and yeah. I'll hand over to Izzy now.
Thanks, and likewise, yeah, it's a real honour to be asked to do this, and I hope that we can, we've learned something in our 20 or so years of working in the industry that we can share that is useful to you guys. I should also say, just Alex, thanks for the introduction. One other thing I just wanted to mention is that I'm currently working and have worked a lot in development which is the section of the industry where we come up with ideas and sell ideas. So I'm quite, at the moment, I'm knee deep in knowing what is working in documentary at the moment, what people are watching, what people want to watch, what people are commissioning. So I hope that's something useful I can share with you too. And Paul, should we just say as well that the way we're going to work this session is we'll do the introductory, sort of the first, hopefully less than an hour, but the first chunk will be sort of the theory of documentary making. And so we'll introduce kind of the different kinds of documentary and kind of the theory of storytelling and stuff like that. And then we'll have a short break. And then the second session, we will talk sort of more in depth about techniques you can use, about what you have in your toolkit. And we'll do then a Q&A at the end. Great, so shall we start?
Let's, if we could have the presentation on screen, please. So, as Alex alluded to, this started from the idea of this workshop came out of the PITCHUA Plus sessions that we all did, and something that we thought we wanted to talk about is define what actually a documentary is. It's quite a complicated question, not obvious, and I try and work out what it is that makes a documentary different from a news piece or a current affairs piece, and apart from the fact it's longer. So what actually is a documentary? And I'll be talking about that in a second, but I think Izzy is going to also just really with her development hat on, from the point of view of somebody who's trying to persuade the big international streamers to give her money at the moment, is going to talk about, essentially the fact that certainly in an international context, documentaries are popular and they are fairly big business. So yeah, next slide, please.
Yeah, I just thought it'd be useful to start, if we're talking about documentary filmmaking in the West, in, the industry we work in, just to really emphasize that it is incredibly successful. It is in an incredibly popular form of television at the moment, in the UK, in the US and in Europe. We put on this, I just wanted to show you, this is Netflix. This is the top 10 television programs this week in the UK on Netflix. And, it's
globally, it was actually. This is a global top 10. This is a global top 10, yeah.
But this is, it's 50% of this is non-fiction stories. There are TV dramas in there, but half of them are factual programs, a biopic about a celebrity, a documentary series about cults, a documentary series about the mafia. But it is factual programming, and people are watching this. And people are watching this. This is the key, I think, the key thing that we want to start, put in your mind is people are watching this not because it's important subject matter, not because it's something they should watch. People are watching factual television because it's enjoyable, because they want to watch it. And this is, because the standard of storytelling and style and pace in factual television in the industry that we work in is matching those drama series for entertainment. So I think it's really important to remember that, it's not a worthy or important subject is not enough to break through in this market. What you need is something that people want to watch. And I think it's a filmmaker's responsibility. You guys have so many important stories that you must want to tell. And it's the responsibility of the filmmaker to deliver those stories in a way that people want to watch. So you're bringing people to the subject matter that is important. And that is the key difference between a documentary and a news feature. You watch the news for information, you watch the news for those important things, but you sit down and watch an hour documentary or longer or a series because of the storytelling and the pace and the drama, because it's enjoyable, it's entertaining.
I just wanted to pick up as well to say that I am well aware and have worked with people schooled in the sort of noble tradition of Ukrainian documentary making, which stretches back, of course, into the days of the Soviet Union and links to the tradition of documentary making in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, those places. And I think that is great stuff, but is not for the much loved by some people, but essentially, as Izzy will be, we'll be going into that. What we have now is what we need now is a much more powerful form, an effective form of storytelling. So, next slide, please. So what I wanted to do is, before we go any further, is just to try and go back to that question about what makes a documentary. Izzy said, yes, you watch documentary because you want to be entertained. And that is absolutely true. You're not just watching it because you want to find out what's happened today. You're watching it because you want to be entertained. But I think it's also fair to say you want to be entertained about something that is real and matters. So people do know that it's real stuff that a documentary is about, and therefore they have interest. That's an obvious point, but still worth saying. Another obvious point, but still worth saying, is that documentaries just go deeper. The stories that they tell have to have a greater depth, complexity in what the facts that you're being told, and the stories that are being revealed and uncovered, and then you would find in other forms of television storytelling. And aligned to that, I think they need to make you feel something. You know, people watch television or any form of art, really, consume any kind of art because of its emotional impact. And a lot of what modern day documentary doing that we see where we work is it's really trying to generate those emotional impacts without letting go of high journalistic standards, high documentary standards, by which we mean accurate, properly sourced, balanced, all those things, that balanced in opinions and all those things that we think is important. So it's very say, but into a subject and tell you more about it and mean more than any kind of news feature can do. And I would the analogy that occurs to me is it's essentially like you're reading a non-fiction book, a history book, rather than a magazine. A document, if you think of it like that, not in terms of the amount of information, but just in terms of the depth, you've got to go deeper. A second or third point is that documentaries ideally should feel cinematic. So that means vague, again, a vague term, but it essentially refers to beautiful images, a certain pacing that allows for the emotions that the story has provoked to resonate and play out so that you feel those emotions to the maximum, and moves you to think more deeply about your subject. We all know what cinema is, but there's my very short explanation of it. And the other thing is, again, touching on why it's not news, is it's not, documentaries aren't generally tied to a current events very closely. They can do, you can make a longer documentary or a longer news piece about something that has recently happened, but that is often where it gets closest to news, extended news features. Generally, documentaries take a step back and go deeper and tell you something about maybe an event that's already happened or that you already know about, but you don't know about in that kind of depth or detail. So I would have thought a good example that I think my instinct is a lot of the really best documentaries about the war, your war, will be made from now till sort of 5, 8, 10 years time. That often is how it works. That's when the best documentaries, for instance, about the war in Iraq were made really around 2010, 2015, when it was possible just to take a little bit of a step back and you had a bit more information to understand what was really happening, and where the people who evolved, who really knew what was happening, were able to talk about it because they were no longer as involved in a live fight, so they were able to reveal the secret truths underneath it and underneath what was happening. And I would just sort of think, again, that's an example of how documentaries go deeper. And just because it's not happening now doesn't mean that it's not important, because the documentary's function then again is to create a deeper understanding, to learn lessons, to stop things happening again, all those things. And all of those kind of high goals definitely motivate a lot of documentary makers, including, I think, I'd like to think, Izzy and myself. So what we're going to do next is, in the next slide, is just show you a clip of a documentary. Now, this happens by coincidence to be a British-made documentary, but is the reason we've picked it is it's winning all the awards right now in Europe, and it's just won the Prix Europa, which is a pan-European festival. It's run at IDFA, and it's won at the Grierson Prize here in the UK.
Before we show it, can I just jump in, because I just want to qualify slightly what I said earlier. I think I was being a bit sort of simplistic by saying that documentaries have to entertain you, because I think actually the word should be engage you. You know, it's not like you sit down to have a fun time. You know, we're talking about, you'll see the clips we've chosen, like Lyra, and that we feel will be relevant to you guys. You know, it's not light-hearted subject matter. This is serious stuff. This is moving. This is tragic in a lot of instances, certainly in the case of Lyra. So it's not entertaining you, but I mean, it's something that you go on a journey with. You are engaged with. You know, it's not something you watch just to find out. You know, I want to watch the news, I want to find out what's happening. It's something you go on a journey with. And I think Lyra is such a good example. As Paul said, it's winning all the awards. You know, it kind of shows how high the bar is for documentary filmmaking. Yeah,
and that's right, Izzy. Again, I think in English, the word entertain doesn't necessarily mean just have a good time. It can also mean learn something that matters, get a genuine emotional response, and that's definitely what's happening here. So just to give you a quick context, this is from the conflict in Northern Ireland, which you may dimly remember. It makes the point that everyone thought that was over 20 years ago, but actually people are still dying. And this is quite a well-known story about a young gay female journalist who grew up in the wrong part of Northern Ireland, in a poor area, and became very prominent as a kind of human rights advocate and various other things, and a campaigning journalist. And then she was shot in a riot by the small elements of the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, that remain active and it's an investigation to why that happened. And this is the trailer. So when you're ready, Alexei, please play.
Hello, testing. My name is Leora McKee. I'm a freelance journalist from Northern Ireland. My passion in life is for investigative journalism.
We were only there for 8 minutes from start to finish. I turned to Leora to say, let's move up further because I think they're going to rush, and she wasn't there.
My heart just broke there and then. She'd been killed.
Police investigating the murder of journalist Leora McKee.
Police blame the so-called new IRA. Happened on the 21st anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement.
I'm trying to piece together what happened. You're coming with me on the journey as I try to find answers.
Truths and there's narratives.
After a 30-year winter of violence, Northern Ireland has the promise of peace.
The truth is what actually happened, and the narrative is what everyone thinks happened.
Leora was certain that 35 years of conflict had an effect on this society.
Our young people have been left behind.
I am the most annoyingly curious person I know.
She would become what she wrote about.
Brick walls aren't there to keep you out. They're there to see how badly you want it.
It has to change. That's what Lyra was writing about. And now we have to do that for her.
I think it's better to go down fighting.
I need more time to keep asking questions.
Just gives you a flavour of obviously an emotional storytelling, but the other thing I'd just like to pull out of that is, and you can see very vividly from that trailer, is there is a really nice mix there of original footage, archive footage, so home video, and the filming on phones of the actual riot where Lyra McKee was killed. And very nice cinematic shots. There's drone shots, aerial shots there that you saw. There are quite nice shots of the church on the title page there. There's simplistic reconstructions of her writing desk, all of which work together to generate quite a cinematic and poetic sense of her life. So that's there. So, Izzy, sorry, yours, over to you.
From a story perspective, you know, and this is a film I really recommend people watch. It really is brilliantly done. But from a story perspective, you know, it's a small story. It's a human story. It's a story of one person. You know, that's the kind of story that we can really engage with. It's human tragedy. It's emotion. You know, we feel that, we understand that. But it's through that small story, we learn the bigger story. We learn the story of 25, 30, 50 years, however many years of sectarian violence in Northern Ireland, which is something you might not necessarily switch on to at 9 o'clock after a hard day's work. But, you know, through that human story, you do learn, you do get the context, you do get that bigger story. And I think that's the key, is finding your way into subject matter, you know, and that is our responsibility as filmmakers, is to find the thing that people are going to watch that tells a story that we want to tell.
That's right. And that's probably the biggest thing of all, really, in answer to the question about what makes a documentary different from a news feature, is that rather than just telling you what's happened or telling you about the investigation into this woman's life, what they do is they tell Lyra McKee's life story, and through that individual story, they tell the whole story of the whole conflict. And it's sufficiently big feeling and important feeling that works. So can I have the next slide, please? So the next slide, Pete, again, is about storytelling, which is, I work a lot in the region, and I think the closest word in Ukrainian that fits what we call storytelling is dramaturgy or dramaturgia. So essentially, that is the heart of it, and that's what you have to do in a documentary. You don't have to do in news. Again, the Lyra McKee is a really clear example of that. So we tell a story at its simplest. You know this, I'm sure, but what's still worth saying, a story is just about a character. Take a character, in the example we've just given, it's Lyra McKee, and that character will move through, or we will talk about how in the past they moved through a series of challenges, which they will overcome or not, until it gets to the end, and then there's some kind of resolution of one kind or another, which can be happy or sad. That is fundamentally what a story is. And into that, and again, it's worth saying again, into that can go other forms of movement through challenges. So sometimes it's literally people facing a challenge as they go through time. Other times it's a journey. They've got to get from one place to another. That's a very common one. And another very common one that's increasingly fashionable, it has to be said, right now in documentaries, is investigation. And I'm currently working on a project with TCA where actually it seems like a history project, but quite often there isn't much to see in the history. So that then the documentary becomes an investigation into where has the object gone. And that's something that's very fashionable at the moment. So, yeah, over to Izzy.
Yeah, just, you know, talking about how factual stuff is rivaling, you know, dramas and, you know, Hollywood films for what people are watching. It's because people are telling factual stories in a kind of Hollywood way. You know, and at its most basic, that is a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. As any story, you know, from Aristotle onwards, everyone knows you need to start somewhere, go through something, end somewhere else. And I think that's a key difference to a news item, which can be more of a slice of life. You know, here we are spending a day with these soldiers on the front line. You know, that's a news feature. But we're going to follow a group of young men as they're deployed for the first time, saying goodbye to their families, going through their first taste of conflict and whatever happens, and, you know, coming out the other side of it. That is a documentary. You need to see change, you need to see obstacles, you need to see jeopardy, you need to see drama. You know, it is not a slice of life. That is really key. You know, it's not a day in the life of someone. And I think really, audiences are much less patient. Aside from a few kind of very beautifully shot festival films, audiences expect to go on that journey. And I think going back to Lyra, that film, you know, it delivers on all this. You've got huge emotions. This is life and death. The stakes are very high. You've got big drama. You've got a mystery. You know, who was it that killed her? Can they be brought to justice? You know, and the key thing to remember, I think, is that by making your story engaging, by bringing your audience along, you're not compromising your story. You know, you're not. I think there's often a feeling when you're telling a story about something very important, you know, that it has to be somber, that it has to be kind of, you know, very serious. But you are actually doing justice to your story by delivering the emotion it deserves. You are doing justice to your story by engaging people, by making people feel what you want them to feel. So I think Hollywood, you know, plan it out. You need your beginning, middle, and end. You need something to happen. You need something to change. You need people to go through challenges and obstacles. And let's talk a little bit about the different, unless Paul's got anything to add, should we move on to different types?
Yeah, next slides, yeah.
At the time, I could talk about that forever, but okay, so next slide, please. There are obviously endless different sort of subgenres of documentary, but Paul and I have, we've tried to reduce it down to the two kind of very most basic approaches to documentary here. The first being an observational documentary, you know, which happens in, we call it a present tense documentary. You know, it is following events that are unfolding. You are filming stuff that is happening. You know, that can be about a single person or a group of people or in an organization or institution, but it is, you know, unfolding events. The second type is generally stories that you can't see. You're not watching happen now. So you have to construct your documentary. You have to tell that story. You have to find a way to tell it. And this is particularly, you know, always true of stories that have already happened. But it can also be, you know, other stories we can't see. So this is where you, as a director, as a producer, as a writer, you have to decide how you're going to tell this story. It's not just following events. And we call this a constructed documentary. And a subset of this is the kind of presenter-led or investigative documentary that Paul's just referenced. There are lots of other types. A big other type is, you know, formatted documentaries, but that's not our expertise. We're not going to talk about this now. So yeah, it's observational, present tense documentaries, constructed documentaries, generally past tense. And you can have elements of both in one film, of course. And yet, for both of these types of film, you need to have all the things we've spoken about in terms of storytelling, in terms of beginning, middle, and end. Just because it's an observational documentary doesn't mean you can just see what happens. You know, you still need to deliver on story. So next slide.
Can I just jump in there? Can I just jump in there quickly before we go to the video, Izzy? So just to say, I have, in fact, I'm, you know, mostly documentaries, I've been the director, and I have actually done both. And I have to say, in the end, I find observational films much more stressful for the very simple reason that you do not know and you cannot control what is going to happen. But at the same time, you still have to deliver this powerful, complete Hollywood storytelling, and that's quite hard work. Anyway, back to Izzy, who's just going to introduce another trailer.
And I mean, we'll talk about, how you can do that in a bit in our second session when we're talking more about the practical things, how you can try to, mitigate against some of the things that are very difficult. But this is an observational documentary, a film by a filmmaker called Matthew Heineman, who is very much awarded. This film was Oscar nominated, I think, Emmy winning, Grierson winning, and it's about the deployment of American troops to, well, actually it was initially going to be about the deployment of American troops to Afghanistan. It ended up being about the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan and sort of what happened next. So a good example of where you can't always plan for what's going to happen. But just the reason we want to show this, I think it shows you how, the things we've spoken about in terms of drama, emotion, Hollywood storytelling, this is a really good example of capturing those in an observational documentary. So yes, if you can play it for us, please.
It's strange and confusing time right now. The Americans trained me, and after being committed for so many years, I just don't believe that the Americans are going to retrograde and leave the country. Our country is everything we have. And since the US left, I can see the sense of abandonment within the Afghan forces. I want to live long enough to see peace in our country, spend time with my family, grow old in Afghanistan, and ultimately die in Afghanistan.
Please. So obviously, as that trailer reminds us, we know how that story ended, and I think it's as Izzy's already suggested, very interesting. They didn't know that was how the story was going to go when they started making the film, but they still found a really compelling story about the guy, this Afghan soldier, and what happened to him and the people he knows. And that is very, very skilled and clever to do that. The other thing it says, so I'm just going to talk a little bit here about observational filming. Again, you may know a lot of this, but let's say it anyway. Observational filming involves access. So obviously that guy's got a lot of access to the American military and the Afghan military, or the then Afghan government military. And observational films depend on access. You have to be able to film things in as uncontrolled a way as possible. Often that will mean that if really interesting things start happening, that the PR people who've given you the access at the beginning won't like it. In fact, you can go so far to say as the more they don't like it, the better it probably is. In a sense, I remember working a lot when I did observational films. I had a commissioner at Channel 4 in the UK who used to say, it's the question that you really worry whether you should ask, that you really think might annoy the PR people. That is the question that you need to ask. And I think that's well worth bearing in mind about observational films. That's what takes you into the heart of the difficult, conflicted, complex issues that are part of life that documentaries are about. It's about complex, difficult things where it's not about easy good guys and easy bad guys. It's not about things that necessarily work out happy with happy endings at the end of the story. It's about the real world as we see it. And let's talk about that and work out what that means. Again, you will, the access and the other type of access, that one is obviously to a military story that might be interesting for you guys, but the other obvious one is celebrity, and that's often another kind of access that will get you money for a documentary relatively easily. That's not enough, as we keep saying. You need that story. Something else I'd just like to pick up on, but it's particularly relevant, I think, in access to celebrity stories, but also stories that are access to business or anything like that, big organizations, is sometimes the PR people want you to give them some kind of control over the final cut of the documentary, the final versions. Or at least, and it's often a bit vague, it's, well, we just want to see it before it goes out. Now, there are different rules in different places for that, but some outlets, like for instance the BBC, just will not let you do that. You cannot do that, and that is enforced by law. Certainly in the UK it is. So a good example that pops into my head at the moment is, I don't know whether anyone's seen the David Beckham documentary on Netflix. Now, I don't know anything about the contract, but looking at it, I reckon the Beckhams saw it before it ended up on Netflix. That would be my judgment and my guess, but I don't know. So I think that's...
probably co-wrote it. I think it's very PR managed, that one.
So that would work on Netflix, but not on other outlets. You couldn't do that on the BBC. So I think that's worth bearing in mind. So if you were, for instance, making a documentary about a Ukrainian oligarch or a Ukrainian politician for whatever reason, you would have to ask yourself how much control do they have at the end, and essentially the less the better, because you can't be honest if they have control. They have to trust you, and they have to let go, and they have to expect that you will tell it how it really is as you see it honestly. But again, some outlets don't care about that and have lower standards. So that's just something to think about. Next slide, please.
Can I just say a little bit, just a couple of brief points on observational, is I just want to say the other thing that's really important on observational is time. You know, if you're looking to get your stories with your beginning, middle and end, your character undergoing change, your journey, your obstacles, you can't film it in 2 weeks. You know, depending on what your story is, but, you know, if you have to have a bit more flexibility to see how things play out, you need loads of time. You know, weeks are not enough. You're probably looking at months or years for something really, truly observational. You know, obviously, you are not just filming vaguely, as we've talked about, you're filming with a story in mind. And just a key point to make about observational documentaries is, you know, an interesting character or an interesting world doesn't necessarily mean an interesting documentary. You know, you can't say, oh, there's this great sports person, and he said I can film with him. You know, I've been watching this documentary about Ronnie O'Sullivan, who's a great snooker player. They had amazing access to him. The film is about his quest to win the 7th world title. You know, it is you have your framework for your observational film. It is a story. It is not just a character. It is not just a world. Okay, I'm sorry. So moving on to our second type of film, constructed. You know, this is very different. This is where we do have a lot more control. from the outset. By constructed, we mean that you have constructed it. This is not a story you're following. This is a story that you are putting together. So like I said before, generally this is a past tense story, something that's already happened, although not always. But how do you do this? What does this mean? Often it's a sort of blow-by-blow account of a story, of a past tense story, which reveals stuff we haven't seen. If it's something we perhaps saw on the news, this is a much deeper dive, as Paul was saying, and sort of a blow-by-blow account that we go along with, we inhabit. It's immersive. It can be a moment in time, like you could make a documentary about the Russian assault on Kyiv, or it can be a much longer period of time, like the entirety of the Iraq War and aftermath, which we're going to show you some clips from a series about that. Or it can be about an individual like Lyra or like David Beckham. But it's not enough to have an important story or subject. It is all about the storytelling. And we'll go into some more detail about that kind of storytelling later. I'm conscious of time, so shall we move on to our next clip? If we have the next slide. We're going to show you a clip from the film Lyra now, just to show how things are put together in one of these constructed documentaries. This is a story that had already happened, as you'll see, and yet the filmmakers have managed here to make it feel like it's something we are in the moment. It's immersive. We still feel like there's jeopardy. We still feel like there's drama, even though we know what's happened. So let's just watch this, and I think it's a great example of this kind of past tense constructed storytelling. Where it's a blow-by-blow account. We know from the beginning of that film, of that documentary, that Lyra dies, and yet for those 2.5 minutes, we are there with them at that riot. We are watching those events unfold before us. It's immersive in the same way an observational documentary is, and that's by the storytelling.
Can I have the next slide, please? So I just also wanted to just pick up on something I touched on earlier, is the sort of subgenres, if you like, of the constructed, which include anything with a presenter, really, where he's going around telling you about stuff, a host. And they generally say presenter in the UK and host in the US, if that's anyone's ever confused. And again, I said earlier, investigations are very fashionable at the moment in history, and journeys. So somebody can, I don't know, travel across India to find what happened to their grandfather who disappeared, or something like that would be a really classic documentary structure. And I'm just going to show you a clip of something. We've shown you a couple of clips of very kind of, if you like, festival cinematic type documentaries. I wanted to show you something that's much more standard commercial international streamers. And I'm just going to show you the pre-title next of a documentary I actually made for Disney Plus and National Geographic last year, which is from a series that you might know called Drain the Oceans. It was very, very popular. And essentially investigates shipwrecks, and it's about people investigating shipwrecks, and through the investigation of that they uncover a story of history which is interesting or important in some way, and you follow the people. The way the structure works of each documentary in the season, there were 5-6 of them in the end, they follow you follow historians, experts, usually divers of some kind, out to kind of find out what really happened. And this particular episode is about a very classic American story, very popular American story about the mob, the rise of the mafia during the era of prohibition in the 1920s, so when alcohol was banned and nobody wanted to stop drinking, so everyone all the mafia guys got involved in it. And this is about that. So if we have the next slide, please, and play. This is a guy who is a kind of mob expert who starts off talking about his personal reason to why he wants to find out this thing, and this is what this history. He wants to uncover this history, and this is what motivates an hour of highly successful and commercial television. If we just play that, please.
I remember watching clips of the John Gotti trial on television.
Gotti, the alleged godfather, intimidating witnesses, running the nation's largest organized crime family.
And you realize, wait, this mob thing is real. That's a real guy. That is the moment that I decided I want to find out more. This thing called organized crime. What is it? How did it originate? And how did these guys actually make money? The problem is the mob hates evidence, but there's some things they just can't do away with. So now we're finding what they tried to hide.
Why was there a truck at the bottom of the river? It was something that definitely should not have been there.
This ship went down fully loaded with cases of whiskey. What happened to the men who were on board?
It was not an accident. It didn't sink by an act of God.
He turned an American metropolis into a bullet-scarred battleground.
These underwater discoveries have clear ties to organized crime. The ultimate question, where did it all start? How did a bunch of otherwise ragtag hoodlums become a national organized criminal syndicate? How did they become the mob?
And so next slide, please. So that just tells you there's some very different tone. Not a tone, I should say, that I necessarily want to do, but when you're a director, sometimes you do a job and you need to give them what they want. So they want something that is exciting and full of mystery and with a nice criminal feeling to it. And that was what we delivered. Obviously, a very high and quite a lot of money spent on those CGI reconstructions of shipwrecks, which is the kind of USP of that series. But again, you could easily repurpose that kind of approach in a Ukrainian context. Somebody goes to find out a mystery. Somebody goes to uncover something that's hidden, and that will tell them something about the Soviet past or something. So that's just a good thing to think about that could really work. Okay, so I'm just going to move on very briefly to talk about distribution, because you do need to know this, because you need to know where your money's coming from in the end to pay for all this. And we're not going to go into details because, in a sense, you can't generalize. But what we are going to do is just split it into very basic categories. So there's TV networks, which when I say TV, I think in English, when we say TV now, we really also mean the streamers. So we mean Netflix, Amazon, Apple TV, all those. They're all a form of TV, basically. And that's where the majority of the money comes, international broadcasters. Izzy will talk a little bit in a minute about what kind of stories might work from Ukraine in that market. But I mean, essentially, I think it's fair to say the more international the distribution outlet, so Netflix, probably the bigger the story has to be. And that doesn't mean big in the sense that you can't do it about one person, like the example of Lyra. You can, but that story about that one person has to represent and stand for something really big and important. And, you know, they will, and in a sense, the further you get away from Ukraine, probably the bigger, more important and internationally known that story would have to be for it to get on a major international streaming platform. Obviously, if you're dealing with a Ukrainian TV station or a regional one, then you don't need to have quite such name recognition. But that's something that is, you know, quite quite big at the moment. Things have to cut through all the other stuff on TV. So David Beckham is another good example. Everyone's heard of him before you make the film, so you switch on and watch. Another thing is public service broadcasting and really film festivals. So the European Documentary Film Festival circuit is an important thing, something that a lot of people will aspire to. There's not a huge amount of money for it. Often your money for your film will come from somewhere else or will come from a public service broadcaster. So what we mean by that is a government broadcaster like the BBC, like PBS in America, Arte in France, Germany, France 2 in France, or ARD in Germany, who are committed and have obligations to produce a certain amount of serious documentary material that is educational, does good. So they would be more likely to fund something that goes into a film festival than a documentary. And then before we go on, I mean, I've just been working recently on quite interesting sort of mini documentaries used on Instagram stories and basically stringing together different cards on Instagram stories to tell a bigger story. And I just think that particularly in your region, and given that social media is here to stay and that people are watching it, that's something to worth think about. You can actually, by sticking 20, 30 cards together on Instagram, you can make a little documentary. Actually, it's not cinematic in the way that some of the things we've shown, of course, but that doesn't mean it has to be bad, and doesn't mean it can't be very informative, and is very, very cheap and very easy to get a lot of interest. So worth bearing in mind there. So that's all we're going to really say about that. And just next slide, please.
I think that's the end, is it?
Yeah, no, we're just going to draw it to the couple of last points really for this first section. Yeah, go on, Izzy.
About what just a few of the things that have been commissioned or have been acquired, has been shown about the Ukrainian conflict on the BBC, just as one broadcaster. Talking about the Beckhams, the biggest names, the mainstream kind of the things that break through. The BBC have commissioned a 3-part series about Zelensky, which is made by one of the the biggest documentary producers in Britain at the moment. So that's kind of the level of access, the level of story you'd need to get a really mainstream commission. And then, of course, there have been many brilliant, smaller pieces about the conflict, like about Mariupol. The People's Story was shown. That was self-shot mobile phone footage, that real sense of taking British Western audiences, into the shoes of people living through the conflict. There was also Storyville, which is the BBC's kind of most arty, most sort of highbrow, respected documentary strand, called One Day in Ukraine. Lots of you might know about that. That was about filmmaking collective who filmed on one day. So it's, stuff is being commissioned, stuff is being shown, stuff is being acquired. And yeah, the more brilliant you can make your storytelling, the more amazing your access, obviously the more likely it is to break through and engage people.
So, and again, those are fairly big subjects, obviously, and there will be more. So I would be optimistic, but also ambitious, and recognise it's a lot of work. So just the last slide, just a few little points that we didn't want to forget about before we move on. And this is the first one, is just something that often happens when I'm watching documentaries made by, shall we just say, less experienced filmmakers, is that they just stick in a lot of words and information. And I just think anyone who's made a film will know that films are quite bad at lots and lots of words and detailed information, because you just cannot absorb it when it comes at you quickly when you're watching. So if you want to do something that has a lot of words and information and needs a lot of complex explaining in words, you're probably better off on radio, make a podcast, or you're better off writing a book or an article. So in a documentary, use the pictures. And the pictures will show something that tells you that some truth, some inner reality about the subject that you're making that about. And that's really important to remember, and just, it's obvious, but again, it's important to say. It's use the pictures, use them to tell you the story. And that might be an example of film footage of something that's happened, archive footage, mobile phones footage, or it might just be seeing where somebody lives, what their house is like, what they do, watching them and seeing how that context of where they live and how they live tells you something deep about that person that is interesting. So again, it's a visual medium, never forget it. And again, kind of back to the storytelling point, the most important thing, it's emotion. People will watch a documentary for a natural human connection to the subject, to be moved. And, you know, obviously in the context in which you guys are operating, is where you have a situation, a conflict situation where there's a lot of propaganda around. I think it's one of the things I worked a lot in sort of counter disinformation theory, and one of the things that constantly comes through is that if you can reach through to people through natural human sympathy, if you can make people care about your characters, even if it's somebody they don't necessarily know very well or instantly feel sympathetic to, if you can make them care about them, then that is the best way of breaking through attitudes and views that may have been shaped or twisted or changed by disinformation or propaganda. And I think that is the great advantage with the kind of Hollywood storytelling documentaries that we're talking about, is that you can reach people and move people through our natural sympathy for each other and what it is to be a human being.
It's the Lyra documentary, you know, it is a human story, it is big emotions, we really care, and through that we get the bigger picture stuff. Just remember that, find your story, find your character, find the emotion, you know, and go and watch Lyra. And I should just say that the director of Lyra, who gave us these clips, you know, wanted to offer her encouragement as well to everyone, you know, and I really do think it's a great example, because she was very close to the subject, it was a dear friend of hers, and you know, she's managed to tell a story with so much heart that will educate people and break through.
So at that point, I think we've probably come to the end of the first section, so I'll just hand back to Alex or Tanya. I think we're going to take a short break, 5-minute break, and then when we come back we'll be talking more practical stuff. That's the big theory. So and so over to you guys, and Alex and Tanya, and Izzy and I will be back in about 3:05.
Колеги, зараз невеличка перерва.
Hello, Tanya. Yes, I am ready to start. So we could have our second presentation document up, please. So welcome back, everyone. I hope that was interesting. So as I said before, this is where we're just going to get into something a little bit more practical, and just to get you in the mood. That image is one that I took in a photograph I took on a shoot that Izzy and I did about 10-12 years ago in northern Norway on the glacier, where we made where actually is exactly the same place where they shot past strikes. So if that looks familiar, that's why. And I just mention it as a sort of place you can go to in a documentary context. And the only problem with that is we managed to give Izzy a frost nip on her toes during this shoot, so that wasn't quite so good. But -40, it was -40 degrees with the wind chill factor. But we were filming a film about Antarctic exploration, so that was why we were there. Anyway, that's just a bit of fun on the side. So I'll move over to the next slide, please. So again, you're making a documentary, you have a documentary, and we just wanted to identify the key elements which we're going to go through in this second section. The first of which is, we've talked a lot about storytelling, or narrative, another English word that means roughly the same thing, how the order of your events are joined together to make a narrative. And that is, again, very close to dramaturgy, another word, all meaning the same thing, really. So we're going to talk a bit about how you control that. So we know you've got to do it, so how actually do you do it? The second thing we're going to move on is talk about production, including cinematography. That's fairly obvious. Interviews. Most documentaries have interviews, I think it's fair to say, even if they're not formal sit-down ones. And when we say sit-down, it's just an interview, somebody sitting talking to camera in the classic fashion, which is very useful, actually, in a way I will explain in a minute. And then editing and post-production, the last bit. And editing in a documentary is, I think, almost always the hardest bit. A documentary editor is a very different beast from a drama editor, and often actually much more skilled, and often actually much higher paid. So, because it's a really, really important skill. So that's what we're going to talk about now, and we'll dive straight in. So next slide, please.
So yes, as you may have noticed, I will bang on about story a lot. Paul has had this working with me. Paul's a brilliant director. I do the producing and writing. So yes, I am passionate about storytelling and good storytelling. And yeah, the main thing to say is, as the director, as the producer, as the writer, you are in control of your story. Even in documentary, even in an observational documentary, you are in charge of it. And it is your responsibility to organize it, to organize the narrative, to deliver a satisfying story, to deliver on those kind of, Hollywood story beats that we've spoken about. And of course, you don't, especially in observational film, you do not know what's going to happen, but you know what might happen, and you know the pathways to making a satisfying story. So, for example, if you are filming, you have access to an amazing hospital. Who knows what's going to come in during the time you're filming there, but you know that in each case that you follow, you need to film stories that have conclusions. Someone comes in, they undergo treatment. Do they live or die? Does the treatment work? You know what storytelling is required in that setting. You're filming with the police. You know that, okay, sometimes you do have like a night shift or whatever, but on the more high-end documentaries with access to the police, you probably follow an investigation. A crime comes in, you follow the team of detectives that are solving it. You don't know what they're going to find, you don't know if they're going to solve it, but you know there will be a story with some kind of conclusion. Same as a sports documentary. I mentioned this film about Ronnie O'Sullivan, the snooker player I'm watching. You don't know if he's going to win or lose, but you know he is undergoing this challenge. And so, yes, the start, in terms of your story, you set yourself a framework where there is going to be a story. It is not a person, it is not an institution, it is about your stories. Now, of course, there are less straightforward versions than what I've just spoken about, where it is much more about character, it is much more about unpacking something more subtle. And, it is your responsibility to get out what you need, to get out the story you need. You create the situations, you create the sequences, you put people in those positions. And don't be afraid, this is a really important bit of advice, is don't be afraid to challenge the people that you're working with. Put them in uncomfortable situations. Put them, in a place where things might come up they don't want to, bad memories. You are in charge. You need to get what you need out of your subjects, out of your story. If it's more like you're filming in a hotel, maybe nothing major happens that day. Can you make a story out of the fact a delivery didn't turn up? You are in charge. In constructed documentaries, telling the story of Lyra McKee, obviously it's much more straightforward because, you are in charge from the beginning. In both of these cases, you're in control, and you need to be in control from the beginning. And your key weapon in this fight is a shooting script, which Paul is going to tell you about. You plan and you have a shooting script. So next slide, please. And Paul will tell you about the mechanics of that planning.
Yeah, so one of the things I've noticed quite a lot working with the wonderful Ukrainian documentary makers I've worked with, some of whom I see are actually on this call. One of the things I've noticed with is that there's a slight tendency sometimes to write the script, either to not write it before you go shooting, Paul, or to write a script and then expect it's not going to change. Now, what happens in the world I've worked in is that people always write a shooting script, but it is no more than a best guess. So it's what you think you're going to happen is going to happen, but you accept that as you start shooting, unlike a drama, as you start shooting, you will adapt it because you find out that things are slightly different from what you thought they are, because things say, interviewees say things slightly differently, or they just talk differently, or sometimes that actually the story you think you're going to tell is actually not the most interesting one. There's something different, which is the point you would probably go back to your commissioner, your funder, or your executive producer, or your PITCHUA consultant, and talk about that and discuss it. So in a sense, the shooting script is best thought of as a best guess, and I've just included, I don't know how much you can see it, but I've just included one from me that I did, which is just sets out how I would typically always set one out. And I don't know whether this is helpful, but I think if you were working for an international broadcaster at any point, you would be well advised to do something like this. And it's essentially a 3-column script, and you have numbers down the left so you can find bits and talk about it. And then you have a picture column in which you note down all the things you think you're going to use here. And then you have the word column, which is going to which is all the things you think you're going to say. And you can even go as far as making up answers from interviewees. You can make them up because if you think you've spoken to them in research, in prep, you should pretty good idea what they're going to say, so you can put that in there. It will always change, but it's is a useful guide. And I think what's so important about doing this from my point of view when I've been directing is that it just, unlike anything else you do in prep, it helps you to think what actually you need to shoot. Where do you need to go and get extra shots, extra material, because you're not quite sure what you're going to say there, or those bits are likely to change. And also it allows you just to plan your shoot. So it's incredibly important to do that, I think, alongside the more obvious things that your production will insist on, such as schedule, planning, and all those other things that happen, such as finding locations, negotiating access, finding interviewees, all those things. So I strongly recommend that somebody does something like this whenever you're before you go and shoot. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. And over to Izzy.
Yeah, so I mean, the key thing about a shooting script, you know what your story is going to be. You know what the beats of your story are, and then, as Paul said, you have the elements of sort of how you're going to tell those stories. And we're kind of looking at what we've called a toolkit, because these are all the different methods you can use to tell those story beats. And the key point I want to make is you don't necessarily need to use all of these. In fact, I'd strongly advise against using all of these. It's not a sweet shop. Just because something is possible doesn't mean you have to or should do it. And I think you work out what tools you have in your toolkit as a documentary filmmaker that best reflect the story you're trying to tell. So, for example, I've just finished a big BBC history series on the Nuremberg trials and post-war justice. There's obviously, that is quite a kind of, it's a very constructed story, it's completely constructed, it's past tense. We use master interviews, archives, a little bit of graphics, and dramatic reconstruction. You know, that's it. You have your palette, you have your toolkit, and you use it. And yeah, just be restrained, I suppose. Have an eye on style. You know, what are the methods that are going to best tell this story? What are the methods that are going to, you know, fill in those columns on your shooting script that bring those story beats to life? Yes, next slide, please.
Just to say, again, the shooting script, all those different sorts of things, you can map those back into the shooting script. So, you know, where are you going to use the interviews? Where are you going to use the general B-roll visuals? Where are you going to use the reconstruction? That should all go into the shooting script. And the more reconstruction or drama you do, the more precisely planned it needs to be. And I'll talk about that in a bit when we get there in a minute. So the next point, everything everyone always loves, is cinematography. And I don't really propose to say very much about this. This has got a lot to do with budget and a lot to do with the talent of the people filming. But it is a basic fact of all television and cinema is the better it is, the better people will think your film is. And that comes down to a lot about budget, lighting, and talent. So just your best is all you can say, but if you can afford a fancy big camera, it will look better, and it still does. That said, it is overall less important than the actual story in a documentary. So it can look wonderful. There's many a documentary that looks and sounds wonderful, but falls down because the story doesn't quite work. But there are many documentaries that look awful but are still great because the story and the storytelling is excellent, and I would really underline that, much as I love cinematography. So not really much more to say about that, beyond the better it is, the better for you. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go straight on to interviews, and there he is, the man himself, and he's sitting there in what looks to me like I haven't seen this, I have to say, live too busy for this for me, but just to in a sit down, looks like a sit down interview. And when we say sit down, we mean a classic documentary interview in which all the two of the three clips we've shown have had examples of, not the retrograde one in Afghanistan, but certainly the woman in the Lira clip talking about the murder. That was a sit-down interview, as it was with the mafia expert in the other clip I showed. And the reason they're useful, those sit-downs, those classic traditional things, sometimes people have said to me, oh, I think they're getting old-fashioned, we're moving away. Well, it hasn't happened, and I don't think it will. And there's a really simple reason for that, is that when you do a sit-down interview, that interview is not part of any one scene in the documentary. It is in another place, a general place, where they're just talking to you. And that means it can be used anywhere, and it will never jump. There is a danger if you are filming, as you can and should also do if you're filming observational material. If you're filming somebody, a doctor, for instance, in the corridor outside the operating theatre, if you suddenly use that interview in a section when he's at home, in a scene where he's at home or he's outside the hospital, it will jump and jar, and it will just slightly confuse the audience and look a bit wrong. And that's what's the great thing about sit-downs, is you can use them anywhere. Location, incredibly important. I mean, the first thing I actually think location is about, was a directing point of view documentary. Finding a location for interviews is about the single most important thing you do once you've booked the interview itself. Just find something that looks right for the subject matter. So again, in that one, the mafia one I showed you, we found a kind of ex-industrial building that looked a bit kind of criminal, with actually had some sort of, it had been used as a drama set, so it had some bars in the back. We didn't really want to show those, because that would look, if it looked like a prison, that would be too obvious and unsubtle. But it just had a general feeling, a bit of a vibe that felt right. So that's what you need to do. And there's the picture of David Beckham in front of a very smart and expensive looking fireplace in, no doubt, his enormous house somewhere in the English countryside. And he's also showing you his very expensive watch. Again, find something that's appropriate to the subject. There's two ways I think that, sorry, Izzy, I'll just go through and then there's two ways I think that interviews are used. One of which is that they can give you authoritative information. So experts or people who knew what really happened or people in the inside. So their way of proving, fundamentally, it's a journalistic exercise in the sense that these are your sources which are proving or appearing to prove what happens. So if you are talking about an event, which may be a contested event, and you know people from the inside who really knew what was happening, then they are giving you a source which you can use to say, this is what we think happened. And if that person, if two people, for instance, on the opposite side say the same thing, then you can be fairly clear that that is probably what happened. So that is probably true. So that's a standard process of journalistic sourcing. They can be used like that. But in documentaries, they're also used to reveal emotion, and something we talked about a lot. So actually, you can cut them in a way where you privilege the information, or you can cut them in a way where actually you privilege the emotion, or you can do both. So that's, you know, that's they fulfill that dual function. The last thing to say is there is always an aspiration, and again something I've come across a lot working with Ukrainian documentary makers, there's always an aspiration not to use commentary voiceover. So often people want to tell it through the emotions, through the interviews, often people want to tell it through the interviews, which is great if you can do it. It is hard to do it, and often to achieve the storytelling these days, what people do is they will write little pickup clips for the interviews that just make the points that you need. You know, it's something in the interview we would be completely happy to say and agree with. It's just a form of words that they didn't use in the interview, but happens to be just what you need to hear. So that is also fine to do. And again, I touched on this a moment ago, but as well as if you do sit down interviews, it is absolutely fine and often a good idea as well to do interviews on location on the hoof. So if you were, for instance, doing a documentary following an army medic in Ukraine, you might do the big sit-down interview where they talk about everything back at their base. But when you are out with them on the job and they're collecting an injured soldier, whatever they're doing, you might just grab a quick moment with them there, and you probably do both. So that's fine. Sorry, Izzy, all yours.
No, I was sorry to interrupt. I was just reminiscing about the time we made our DOP film in an underground vault because we were doing a film about the Blitz, and he was very unhappy about that, wasn't he? But we felt, you know, that being in an underground, vault did evoke the feeling that we were trying to get across from those interviews. And just to go, follow up on Paul's point about, location, I think the thing about your master interviews, your sit-down interviews, is there a real chance for you to set the tone and style of your documentary. So yeah, is it David Beckham in his big house with his, fancy watch? Is it an expert, out of time and place against a neutral or black background who is telling you authoritatively their version of events? Is it, going back to this documentary I've been watching about Ronnie O'Sullivan, the snooker player, the filmmaker has filmed the master interviews with him lying down in bed, not even looking at camera, because that evokes a real sense of intimacy. That makes you feel like you're in his head. So really think about what you're trying to get across from these interviews. Is it, authority, or is it intimacy? And think about, stylistically, visually. These are going to be something you keep coming back to. So it's a huge part of the look of your documentary.
Sorry, as he finished, now I've got another point, just very quickly.
Just going to be boring points about sort of planning. As Paul said, the aspiration to do no voiceover. this is where your shooting script comes in. You literally have in your shooting script all the story beats you want this expert, this interviewee to talk about. So you know what they've got to cover, you know, from your shooting script. This isn't a vague list of questions. You can be, you know, I've recently filmed interviews that were completely like talking about, right, let's talk about this one moment, because I know this is a beat in the story. Let's talk about this next moment. You know, you're planning. You also might want to think about how your interviews are going to intercut with each other. Have you got two people talking about the same subject? Have you already interviewed one and they've said something that you think this person could comment on? You know, it's always planning, thinking about where everything is going to sit together. Do you want to have them on different sides of the screen so you can intercut them? Just another practical, boring tip is increasingly we're using two cameras for interviews. You know, maybe a side one and a front one, just because then you can intercut more easily. You've got more options. It makes your edit easier. So yeah, think about the style, your visual approach, what kind of tone you want from the interviews, and then practically map it to your story beats, look in your shooting script, think about the practicalities of your filming.
Yeah, just picking up on that, Izzy. So the two camera thing is definitely very fashionable at the moment. I would say that's the current fashion in documentary interviews. There was another one a few years ago that you will probably have seen, and a good example of this would be if you've ever seen the Oscar-winning documentary Touching the Void. The other one was the one where the interviewee looks straight at the camera, and that was very fashionable maybe 5-10 years ago. And that used a particular piece of kit. I've had people in Ukraine trying to do it, and there's a particular piece of kit called the iDirect or the Interatron that is effectively, it's like an auto cue mirror that is used to do that. And that was a very fashion that I suspect will come back again. But right at the moment, everyone wants the two camera thing. But again, it really is just what's hip right now. I'm ready to go for the next slide with you, Izzy.
Yep.
And this is a clip that needs to be played.
Yeah, so just to set it up, this is a clip from a BBC series about the Iraq War. You know, quite different from Lira in that it's much more, you know, there's much more time between, much more time as elapsed, so it's slightly more sort of authoritative, I suppose. And this is a clip about the capture of Saddam Hussein. And there's a few things to look out for. You know, one is the style. Look at the style of the interview. Look at where they've shot it. Look at how they are doing it. Look at how they use both a sit down and a kind of in situ interview. Look at the caliber of the interviewee. This is the guy that did it. You know, this is the kind of person you want if you're telling this documentary about events. Get the people that were there. And finally, just look at how they also managed to get in a sense of emotion and a sense of his character into his interview. So yes, if we can watch this clip, please. Upon a time in Iraq. And I love the way that clip shows, you know, the kind of the news footage that we all saw. You know, that's what we remember. We've got him. And how then this documentary takes you behind that. And like, here's what we didn't see. Here's the guy that actually got him. Here's what was going through his head at that point. And I think, you know, that's a great example of a difference between a news feature and a documentary, is that level of access, that going deeper.
Can I just come in with another point also, is that something that I watched it feeling it is, and I think you sense this through the documentary maker's question that is given to that guy, when in the scene, if you like, the in actuality interview, which he does looking at the photograph, he asks him, he looks a bit beat up, because obviously what that guy talks about, and but because he explains it actually as being his own need for revenge. I don't know anything about him, so I don't know what Saddam Hussein did to his family. But we all know that whilst Saddam Hussein is is definitely a bad guy, he's also being beaten on arrest there. And that's something that shouldn't happen. That's definitely not what they should be doing and is wrong, even if it's Saddam Hussein. And I think there's a really good example of how the documentary there is showing the complexity and difficulty of human life is that this guy who's ultimately arresting somebody who has terrorized his country for generations and murdered countless people and worse, there's a desire for revenge that maybe moves that guy into a space that is not morally absolutely good. And I think that's a really good example of the way the documentary maker has shown him laugh. He's got no remorse, and it shows him that, and that makes you think. Now, is that revenge understandable, justified, or is that actually a bit chilling? And I think that's the question that the documentary raises by showing it in all, life in all its complexity and uncertainty and moral ambiguity. Everyone understands that if Saddam Hussein had killed that guy's family, then you can understand why he might have done that if that's the case. One assumes he has some personal reason to be angry with him. But it's just really interesting to see the way the documentary brings that out and makes you think about it. And that's a really good example of depth that comes in that section, I think, and makes me quite uncomfortable watching it. It's pretty clear that the documentary maker is not totally cool with that. It doesn't, thinks that that's a difficult thing to have, that moment, but it is that guy and it is what happened. And I bet, going back to what we were saying about access, I bet if a PR person had final control of that clip, that bit would have come out, because that does not show that operation to arrest Saddam Hussein in the clean way. It shows something slightly different, and that is a really good example of why you need to not give up control of your documentary. Right, over to you, Izzy, and next slide.
I think it's you, isn't it?
Is it me?
Is
it me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So next slide, actuality. So this is, again, in a sense, the most obvious kind of documentary that most people think of first, which is actuality, which is one of the terms we use in English. There are many. Observational actuality, sometimes just documentary filming, and it means filming stuff that's happening now. And there will, in any observational documentary, there will be a certain amount of that. Even in constructed documentaries, there will be a bit of that. So when if people are researching something historical, they go to a library, we see them get the book, and for the first time they see the document that answers the question, and you would want to capture that. So it's all about finding as real and honest emotion as you expect, and is often the first thing that people think about with documentary. I wanted just to touch on briefly on a couple of sub-examples of that. One is, obfuscation, or even docu-soap. What used to be, there was a fashion a few years ago for this, where maybe you just get access to an airport and you just film it to see what happens, or Izzy mentioned earlier, a hotel. So a classic thing, and Izzy and I both know somebody who's done quite a lot of this. They go to a really expensive hotel, like the smartest hotel in London or New York or Paris. You get access and you just film all that happens. So somebody's lost the prince who's come to stay's luggage, and it's like panic, and you film that. And then somebody else has got to get the new restaurant ready, but it's not ready because the lights won't work, so you film that. And again, that often organizations will go for that and let you do that, because ultimately it's great PR, because you get to look at what a fascinating place it is, this airport, this hotel, whatever it is. And that's something that's done quite a lot. But again, the less the PR people have final control, the better. And again, you can do serious versions of that. If you did a hospital in Ukraine, for instance, would be an example where you could do that, and that would be a compelling documentary idea at the moment, where you will definitely get strong human stories in that concept, in that place. There's a word that's often used in English for that, which is precinct, which is basically, in commissioning, here are the sort of places where people like to go and make documentaries like that. There's a subgenre of that which was very popular here and has been used a bit in America and around the world, but is where you do a you rig a location, for instance, a hospital, with hundreds of fixed cameras. Quite expensive, but I just touch on it as something that was very fashionable. So it's like the Big Brother entertainment show, but applied in a real place. That was very fashionable. Again, it's slightly dying off at the moment, but is there one of those things that will come back. And again, even as I touched a moment ago, even in constructed past tense documentaries, you can set things up to see what happens. So if you know, for instance, that somebody's going to meet, for instance, their long lost cousin or parent or something like that, you know you're going to do that, and you will set it up to film that in an actuality way, so you get the genuine emotion that can only be filmed once. So that is another, and that can be in all sorts of different genres. So that's in a sense, the most obvious documentary stuff, and most documentaries, not all, but most, have some elements of that. Over to you, Izzy.
Okay, yeah, next slide then, please. Okay, so archive. I mean, this is something I work predominantly in historical documentaries, so this is something that I work with a lot. By archive, we mean any footage or images or audio that you acquire to tell your story. So anything that you haven't gone out and shot or recorded. So this can be, you know, old footage, World War II footage. I've just made a film about the Nuremberg trials, so I've, you know, been through a lot of historic archive footage for that. You know, or that could be news footage, like the stuff we've seen in those clips from Once Upon a Time in Iraq. It can be social media footage, like we've seen in Lyra. It can be, you know, pages from social media. It can be audio recordings someone has made, or it can just be any stock footage. You know, we need some pictures of mountains. We need pictures of a busy city. So anything that you acquire rather than shoot yourself. And it's a, you know, fantastic tool, as you all know, as filmmakers. And, you know, there's various different ways in which we can use it. Sometimes it is just wallpaper, you know, general visuals. So like, you know, like we've said, a busy city. Sometimes it can be a brilliant way to fill a gap in your footage. So perhaps in one of your interviews, someone is talking about how they, you know, cycled through this street when something was going on. You know, you can find some footage of a kid cycling through a street. It doesn't have to be them. It's a great way to fill a gap, you know, and you can use it to set the scene. If we're going to see a clip in a minute, you know, where we want to set the era, we want to get a tone for the era that we are in, for the historical period. And finally, you know, it can be used as a story beat in its own right. So going back to this film I've just made about the Nuremberg trials, we would take actuality from the archive. So Hermann Goering making his plea of guilty or not guilty, that is an element of our story. That is a beat in our story. So you use the archive to get across that drama. You know, and the key when you're doing something like that is to make it dramatic. Is to make it feel immersive and alive. And there's lots of ways you can do that. Our interviews were all done in the present tense. So you have archive footage of Hermann Goering walking to the witness box in Nuremberg. And your interviewee is saying, he is thinking, this is the moment. You know, it feels like you're there. So yeah, you use that archive footage like you would use other footage. You mine it for your drama, for your emotion. And yes, we've chosen another trailer to show you now of a documentary series called Fear City, which is about 1990s New York, about the mafia. So again, you know, talking about the mob, about the police efforts to bring down the mafia. And I think we want to show this trailer because it just shows you how evocative archive footage can be. It's an amazing way to set up that story world we're going to be in. And the other point to make is they make a big deal out of unheard audio tapes. this is a real fashion in Western documentary making at the moment. Any unseen footage or unheard audio has a real cachet at the moment. Anyway, this is just fun, so let's just have a look at this. It's a nice counter to all the serious stuff we've been looking at today. So yeah, if you could play it, please.
People once called New York Fun City. Now the police are calling it Fear City.
In the 70s, city of New York was owned by the mob.
We were untouchable. I didn't feel New York was mine for the taking. I thought we already took it.
They had judges they put on the bench. They controlled restaurants, the docks, the ships, hospitals, and go on and on.
It was total anarchy. You knew if you didn't pay on time, they'd bend your leg and stuff it in your pocket.
Law enforcement didn't have any power to do anything.
It was the golden era of the mob. The FBI couldn't keep up with us. There was no way.
The boss asked me to come to his office, said, we want to indict all 5 families at the same time. I said, what, are you shitting me?
We're going to bug the families.
The Gambino family.
The Genovese family. Colombo, Lucchese.
Banana. We were going to hear them on the tape with our very own ears.
Listen to me. I'll sever your fucking head.
The bugs would change everything.
This was the biggest organized crime case ever.
You don't want to screw this up. You don't want to be the guy who let the mob bosses off.
My partner and I were listening. I heard something unusual.
Play it again. Oh my God, he was having a torrid affair with his maid.
It was kind of awkward.
I had just turned 29.
We were novices with this momentous case.
The supervisor said, I don't think women can work organized crime. He said, you'll be the only woman on the squad, and I was. Welcome to New York.
We realized the mafia controlled the entire construction industry.
This job's in the electronic 19 years.
You control the unions, you control bankers, you control the country.
The conspiracy was stunning.
The boss, he had 20-something guys killed.
A work foreman was thrown out a 56-floor window.
Failure was not an option.
We're surveilling, and I hear that wire doesn't belong. Everything goes dead.
Shit.
We're on to something big, mind-boggling.
I mean, it was psychological warfare.
Betray your brothers and you pay for it with your life. This is the story of New York.
I never heard so many creative uses of the F word in my life.
You mom. Thank you.
It's all fun. Just next slide, please. Before we go on, I'd just like to make the point, Izzy's kind of made it, I just like to make the point is that all of that is old footage. And there is a real fashion that was made in London, that series. And there is a real, not filmed obviously, but all the editing and the production company. And I think there's just a real fashion for taking old footage and chopping it up and editing it in an energetic, fun way. And the whole series is a bit like that. And that is something absolutely you guys could look at do with stuff out of archives. You know, if you have a great story, that's the sort of thing you can do. You can chop it in a way and it comes back to the storytelling and also this extra element that they've got, which is probably the bit that got them all the money. They've got the unheard of tapes. So, but ultimately what you're watching is old footage chopped up in a modern way, in a new way.
It's
So,
like
anyway.
Another real award winner over here was a documentary about Chernobyl, which was called Chernobyl, The Lost Tapes, which was about a cache of archive footage that was found, that hadn't really been seen before. And that is literally just putting together all this footage that was filmed around the time of the Chernobyl incident and afterwards. And that's all. That commission was completely based on a new store of archive that was found.
Anyway, so but go on to the visuals. So again, just something that you're always going to need in a documentary, and sometimes people forget to shoot it, and it's always an issue, which is that is visuals, which in the US is often called B-roll, and this is just all the other filmings you do, and I think it's the most important thing you do, really, along with the interviews. And it's also the cheapest, because there is nothing cheaper than a lovely shot of a sunset or a tracking shot out of the window of a car through a forest, and you can use it in many places. It's flexible, and the way you shoot and the way you do it will help you tell the story and give you the emotion of the story. So find those things that you can film that help you convey the emotion inside the story, and that is essentially one of the key roles of the documentary director. And find those and shoot those, and there's not much more to be said, I don't think, apart from that, beyond think of the things that'll work. I mean, traveling, moving is always good. Film things really nicely, use your cinematography, give yourself time, don't not do it. I find when I've been shooting, it's often good to think of a day shooting as you might do an interview or 2 interviews, and then you will give the rest of the day, or you'll do to filming B-roll and visuals, or you'll do an interview in the morning and then go and film things that you plan in advance in the afternoon. And that really is quite a good mental rule that I would have for myself, for making sure you've got enough stuff, and trying again match it again, looking back to the shooting script. This will you should have an idea of that, where you'll need shots of a forest, or shots of empty Kiev streets at night, or shots of a snowy field, or whatever it is that you'll need to help you tell this story. And that's really important. Next slide, please.
I mean, if you look back at the Lira clips we showed, just how those kind of visuals can really elevate archive footage as well. So in the sequence when she's murdered at the riot, there's just those couple of shots, drone shots, I think, of cars moving along a road, and of the church, a drone shot going up over the church. It just really elevates your footage. It just really, especially when you're using sort of social media phone footage or whatever, it just really tells you, as Paul's saying, this is what we're feeling, this is big, this is, this is beautiful, this is elegant. Yeah.
And you need that. Also, just to sort of moving on to what we're talking about is drama and CGI. Actually, thinking about that shot in Lira of the car moving on along the road, and it's the moment when the interviewee lady says, "We went up to the riot." I would probably call that a form of reconstruction. I think they have arranged for those cars to drive along the road at that point. They're cars that the production team are driving, probably with a radio, and it may even be the drone operator, and that they know they're going to need in their shooting script. The director knows they're going to need to talk about the moment when Lyra McKee and her friend who's talking go up to the riot, which unfortunately she is then killed at, and so they know that, so they shoot that shot. They probably shoot it after the main interview. I mean, again, in terms of sequencing, since they live in Belfast, they don't have to travel to do it. I suspect that was shot. That shot was shot deliberately to go on that. And that's again something that you can do. And when you're talking about drama reconstruction, so again, something that you would do if you have the budget, and if you choose to, you might have elements of drama reenactment, or where people dress up in costumes and pretend to be whoever it is this time, your Soviet official dealing with the Chernobyl incident or whatever. If you're going to do that, if you decide you're going to do that, then my advice would always be shoot it halfway through the edit. Because if you shoot it too early, you'll find you have shots that you don't use because you have either cut that bit of interview and you're not telling that bit of the story, because in the end it's just not so interesting when you don't have time, or the shots aren't quite right for the way the interviewee speaks. So my mental rule was always to try and take a break if you could, and shoot your drama reconstruction, anything elaborate, later on in the edit. Again, in a documentary, you don't absolutely know the final words of the script. The script you have when you go shooting will change. And so therefore, if you can leave the drama reconstruction stuff as late as possible, that is a wise move. And just have the next slide, please. I'll just give you some examples from little things, little pictures there to inspire you. So again, if you're doing CGI, so again, that one left is from the Drain the Oceans that I mentioned. That was an expensive CGI shot of a rum running tugboat. So a tugboat that was full of illegal whiskey heading to Atlantic City, and that was sunk, and that was expensive. And that was, I think I'd finished the edit before I saw the final shot, but we knew it had to go into this spun, and I'd seen rough versions. And then there's a drama set there, and also another one again with a card, just to give you things that you can do if your budget allows. And equally, CGI and animation can be very widely used in the right film to talk about things where you can't film it, and you guys know that, because that's something I know that you often use generally, so you know all that, and don't need to talk about it. So next slide, please.
Okay, yeah, I'm just quickly to mention sort of other kinds of graphics. Graphics can be a really good way of delivering information as well. You know, a visual way to get across information, like a structure, a hierarchy, or you know. So it's sort of, yeah, just another thing in your toolkit. And I just think, yeah, it's a really good point that Paul made about like these kind of minimal reconstructions. You know, that it doesn't have to be full drama costume. Yeah, someone driving in a car, your policeman who you're following a case about, get him to drive the same route he drove the night that he got the news, you know, and that is essentially recon. It's really, really useful. So yes, finally, now we're on to the edit. And this is where, you know, all your amazing planning, your shooting scripts, you know, shooting all your interviews, everything that you've you know, your interviews that cut with each other, or your shots that match your story beats. This is where you basically realize if it works or not. And I would say, I don't think I've ever done an edit. Have you, Paul, where your shooting script was the final script? You know,
No.
this is...
No.
But what having your shooting script means is that you have all the necessary elements to tell your story. You may do it in a completely different order. You may cut a lot of the beats, but you know, because you've planned it, you know when you get in that edit, you have got all the building blocks that you need to tell the story that you are trying to tell. This is not where you should be working out what the story is. You know, you might find a storyline takes precedence in a way you hadn't thought it might do because of the caliber of the footage or the interviewees. You might find that a storyline actually doesn't work. I mean, the last thing I did, we cut a whole storyline in the edit, which is a huge waste of money. And, you know, I'm not advising you do that, but I suppose I'm just saying that, yeah, it's, you know, you have to be prepared to let things go in an edit, but be assured, because you're well planned, you have got what you need. You know, but it's a long process, an edit. You know, I don't know how long you guys are used to spending editing a film, but the last one I did that was 60 minutes, we were in an edit for 11 weeks, and that was considered quite, you know, that was pretty normal, and people I know have spent a lot more time editing 60 minutes of TV.
I think, yes, Izzy, I think that one thing I've noticed, again, working with Ukrainian friends, is that they don't necessarily edit as long as we're used to. I mean, I think people tend to allow edits to go on, partly because it's the cheapest part of production, of course. You've only got to pay for an editor and a director and a few other people and an edit suite, so it is relatively cheap. But also that the demands of the kind of storytelling that we've discussed are so high, and it is an edit is where that's made. And it is always, always, always very hard work, the edit. It is the hardest bit of a documentary. And as I say, I do drama and documentary. And in drama, the shoots are hard, the edits are easy. And in a documentary, the shoots are relatively easy, usually. And the edits are hard. And they go on for weeks. And I think 12 weeks would be typical, really. Something like the Fair City that we've just shown a couple of. I mean, I happen to know that the first episode of that was probably edited for 4 or 5 months. I mean, months and months of editing. And it goes over and over again. And then you have all these executives who like to change things, which is maddening, of course, but that is part of it. But I also think that there is some rationale behind that, which is something I always like to say is that I think the process of editing, and you'll know this as filmmakers, but it's still worth saying, is that the more you are in an edit and the closer you get to the documentary, the harder it is to see it clearly as you would do if you were seeing it for the first time. And in English, we have this nice expression, which you cannot see the wood, as in wood as in forest. You cannot see the wood for the trees. And that is, I think, just really useful to bear in mind. And I always tell myself that somebody who's watching it for the first time can always see it clearly. And that is just what you lose the closer you get to it. And as it should work, the job of, in an edit, there should be really a kind of hierarchy where the director hands it to the editor who does a first assembly, and the director then has some freshness to see that. And then you have a producer or an executive producer who will come in and watch it, and they will see it more clearly again. And then lastly, you'll have somebody from a channel or whoever's paid for it, and they will see it. And that should be, but often isn't, but that should be a very healthy process of seeing it clearly and making it better, because you can see the things that the people who are actually doing it are too close to it to see. And that is essentially the process of editing, I think, in a documentary. And then there's all the other fun things which are massively important, such as music, pacing, making it feel cinematic. All those things are massively important. And again, that's more a matter of just doing it and having the right people working for you to make that work. So that's all I've got to say about editing.
And I think, yeah, that's pretty much all I've got to say. I think we're going to end on another clip from Once Upon a Time in Iraq. And we've chosen this just because we think it's a really nice example of showing how stuff is made in the edit. You know, you'll see in here, there's lots of elements from the toolkit that we've spoken about. There's actuality, there's master interview, there's archives. But what I want you to look out for is how the editors and the director in the edit have injected a sense of style to it. You know, they've included little off-camera moments, or the things that maybe they thought were off-camera moments. And, you know, look how they've used music to tell you what to think. That's a mistake. Look how music is used to tell you what to feel, because that's what music does in an edit. It will tell you what you are feeling when. You know, is it suspense? Is it sadness? And look at the pacing of it. Don't be afraid of pauses and silence. And before we play it, I should just say it is a bit distressing. So yeah, but let's have a watch of this clip. Just to say that, you know, we've shown a couple of clips that you know, show one point of view here, but that in the series they do show, you know, lots of other point of views. It is a kind of you know, shows all sides. And just
I think that's, yeah, sorry, Izzy, just jump in there. I just think that's really worth saying is that documentary series is part of a genre that they do. The BBC actually does a lot, which I think will be deeply relevant and will be done about Ukraine and the current war in due course, which is, if you like, a first draft of history. And they do it a few years after, when people can actually talk about what really happens, and they try to interview everybody from all the sides to get to, in a sense, a real historical document. So in that case, what they try to do, everyone who supports the invasion from the Iraqi opposition, everybody from outside, from the America, and also they'll try and get people sympathetic to the regime who at least can speak to what they thought. And they'll try and do everyone from all sides. And the point is, of that kind of thing, is not to give an opinion, but to actually try and say what we think really happened. And that is another kind of documentary making that is, you know, to be very, very respected and worth bearing in mind. And Izzy's about to take us through a list of documentaries that we've come up with, which are more recent. But it's worth looking up of some of those on those BBC ones which aren't on this list, and one that might be of interest to you. There is one called Russia in the West, which you will find BBC Russia in the West, and it has interviews with about every big name you can think. It was made 3 or 4 years ago, so before the current war, but was, you know, very significant. And there are many others made by a particular documentarian in London whose name is Norma Percy. She's an American, but she is known for working all the time and interviewing everybody, including all the presidents, all the prime ministers, all the generals, everybody, and seeing what they really say. Anyway, over to you, Izzy. Sorry.
Great. So yeah, next slide, please. Just to wrap up, we've just put some examples of things that we think are worth watching in terms of, you know, really good examples of storytelling, like we've spoken about, and of different kinds of documentaries. So yeah, All That Breathes is an Oscar, I think it was an Oscar winner, or certainly Oscar nominated, but it's just very, very beautiful. And this is you know, different to what we've spoken about. This is, you know, it is very kind of poetic and cinematic and meandering, I suppose, actually, but it's a really good example of the caliber of, you know, if you are going to make something purely observational and very beautiful, you know, what you need to deliver on that. Lyra, which we've spoken about and you've seen, really worth watching. You know, the Beckhams is worth watching at the other end of the spectrum of something. I personally think it's very PR controlled, but, you know, a different kind of storytelling. And then I put a couple of examples on there of, you know, Chernobyl, the lost tapes, and AIDS, the unheard tapes, just to show the fashion for, you know, unseen or unheard archive at the moment, and what, you know, what you can do with archive. That's something that I'm very interested in and passionate about. And finally, I want to add the Ronnie O'Sullivan documentary I've been watching this week, which is really just, it is a really good example of documentary filmmaking, of something observational, with the constructed elements. And as a final note, I would personally just like to say that, you know, I'm aware that Paul and I are speaking from a position of massive privilege, where we have, you know, working in London, we have the capacity to do things, we have the budgets to do things, we have, you know, we are working in normal times, and how much harder it is for all of you to be making the films that you want to make. And so I'm sorry if we seem like, you know, we are not acknowledging that position of privilege that we have, but we are just trying to share with you, you know, working as we have done, being lucky enough to work as we have done, those lessons we've learned. And, you know, all of them might not be applicable to you. There might not be an option for you to have an 11-week edit, you know, a 12-week edit. Isn't that a luxury? But I suppose what we're saying is that you can take away from it is, you know, it is a very important stage of your program, and give as much time and energy to it as you can. But yeah, we are, you know, hugely honoured to have been speaking to you today, and I really hope some of what we've said is useful to all of you. So thank you for listening.
Totally second that from Izzy. And also, just to say, the one thing I will say in addition to that is, if we can give you a little bit from what we've learned doing what we've done, that you can take that and tell really powerful stories, important, that are for the good of Ukraine. So I really hope that's the point. And yeah, I think we're going to move on to questions now, if that's if anyone's got any. Have any of you got any questions? No? I can just see a note here, question that's come in the chats from Sergey. I totally agree, Sergey. I know it's torn from the realities of Ukraine. I just replied to you there. I understand. I'm not trying to tell you that maybe it will help. Because again, total humility, a total understanding of what your situation. But you know, I do work with some Ukrainians who are definitely aspiring to this and doing this standard, and that's really encouraging and exciting. So I hope, you know, I hope we can all be optimistic. That's all I can say. Has anybody, I don't know, anyone else has got any questions?
Пол, в чаті також є запитання, яка вартість...
There is a question in the chat, Paul. Well, actually, what is the cost of the documentary projects in Great Britain? We understand that that's really very different, but if you can tell us what's the range of the costs, well, and you can share it with us, the viewers and our participants will be very grateful to you.
No, sure. So I have some, yeah, I mean, it's a big, massive variation. So I think some is made... Obviously, it's an expensive country, so you're dealing with high costs, but some can be made for very, very little. So 40, 50,000 pounds, euros, as little as that. That sounds a lot for you, but here that really is, everyone's not working for any money. It's a kind of short film budget. And some of that. The Lyra documentary, I know, was a labour of love. It took her years, and the director basically doesn't have a lot of money, and it took her years, and that is absolutely, you can do that. Some of the other things we've shown have been higher end, more expensive, so things like Fierce City or The Drain the Oceans are much more expensive. They have big budgets. Again, that can be $500,000 dollars an hour easily. That's the very top end, sometimes more than that. But average, I don't know what you'd say, average, it can be anything within that, and more at the bottom end is the truth.
It depends on the you've sold it to, so which is a very privileged position to be in, so you get the funding to make it. But you sell to some terrestrial UK broadcasters, and you can, it might be £100,000 an hour. You sell to Netflix. If you're making a Beckham series, you might be talking about, at least $1 million. And it's hugely different. And then, like Paul says, if you're making a film, as a labour of love, you can do it for very, very little money. But yeah, commissioned documentaries are probably in the range from 100,000 to...
One thing I will say is that most documentary makers, and that's what they do, are not terribly rich. Is essentially, it's not, they don't make a lot of money, most of them. Some of them do, but if you want to make money, that's not necessarily what you do. The exception is those who work in those very commercial things like those Netflix shows. But that's not where most of them are, I think it's fair to say. Sorry, Tanya.
Так, дякую. Друзі, якщо хтось хоче задати питання голосом, ви можете увімкнути камеру.
Dear friends, if you would like to ask a question orally, please, you can unmute your microphone and ask the question, or you can write in YouTube. But so far, we can see only the gratitude which is expressed in YouTube to Lizzie and Paul. Well, if there are no questions, then we can complete our webinar.
In the chat.
There's a question from Kostyantin in the chat in Ukrainian, which I'm afraid I'm trying to read, but I don't know exactly what he's asking.
Why a documentary? Well, please. Well, he is asking you to see the actually real and tell what is your opinion about it. But I am afraid it's not possible to do now.
Not today, no.
There's a question about a pitch deck as well.
That's one for you, Izzy.
One for me, this is my world at the moment.
Ну, тут я брала участь у роботі з тими, хто подавав свої пітчі на українському проєкті.
Sorry, I can hear the translation as well. But yeah, I mean, the idea of a pitch deck is, it's a combination, a bit like a documentary, it's a combination of sort of words and images that are selling your story. Really basically, I know we haven't got time, I would normally do a kind of front page or two. That's the kind of the outline of the story, that's like the big sell, what is this, why is it different to what's gone before, and I do that in a combination of images and words. And then I'd probably do, you know, a page on your visual approach. I'd probably do a page on your archive, if you've got unique archive or access or something. And then if it's a series, I might do a page on each episode. But yes, I would, you know, you are selling the tone of it. You're selling the feel of something. So it's about the right combination of, you know, images and, yeah, the real sort of top line about what your project is about. And then those key points about like your archive, your access, and your visual approach. So that's a very short answer, but I hope that's some help.
Yeah, I mean, I just also say, I think what they'll do, to try and sum it down, people will look for the story and the access, and they'll look for that. They'll look for, if you've got something, as Izzy says, something like lost tapes, lost recordings, they'll look for that, something that makes this different from anything else. They will make an assessment on who you are and whether they think you can do it. So it's good to include some images or a tape, a pitch tape. Often things, unless you've got a good relationship with whoever you're pitching at, I think having a tape is really useful. A little pitch tape or a sizzle, as they call it, of showing you what you're going to show. So I think that's really important. All those things will go in a bit. There's another question from Natalia, who I've worked with, I remember.
Так, власне,
film about Abkhazia. Unfortunately, I don't know which one she's talking about, and she says it hasn't been completed yet. So Natalia, can you turn on your mic and the cam, or at least your mic, to ask your question yourself? Well, you're supposed to know, so let me read it in full.
Yeah, well, I didn't know anything what happened, but what I do know is the last conversation I had with Natalia was on February the 20th last year, so we all know what happened then. So I hope it will be finished. That's all I can say.
Добре.
Any other questions?
All right.
One other thing I should say is just thank you to Keo Films as well, who let us show the clips from Once Upon a Time in Iraq. And again, you know, really supportive of what you guys are doing. And yeah, you know, your media equivalents in other countries are really behind you. And that's it for me.
That's it from me. Good.
Добре, добре. Тоді ми дуже дякуємо.
Okay, all right. So then we thank Paul and Izzy very much indeed. And should you have any questions, should you come up with any questions, you're welcome to write to us. Oh, there's one more question. No, it's not a question, just thanks. So contribute your writing to TC8, and perhaps we'll forward this information to Izzy and Paul. And let's keep in touch. Thanks a lot to everyone.